I was just a young man in my natural prime. Worked out on the railroad, the old PRR line, shoveling coal in the big fire box, making smoke and steam. Was a job I loved to do, fulfill a boyhood dream.
Welcome to Rails Around York.
A steam locomotive needed regular attention to its many parts to keep it running. What and where were these parts that needed inspecting and repairs?
Don Bretz was one of many employees who worked for the railroad. Don started his career in 1945 at the Enola Engine House. In his career, he worked different jobs.
He retired in 1989, having worked for the Pennsylvania, Penn Central, and Conrail.
Come along on this Rails Around York as Don Bretz takes us on a walking inspection of number 6755 and M1B on display at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania.
My name is Don Bretz. I worked on the Pennsylvania Railroad back in 1945 after high school. And since I knew I was going to service, we decided in the family that I would get a job that I might have something to go back to after my service was completed. And I went to the Enola House where members of my family had spent a good many years employed in the locomotive shops, repairing locomotives. This particular locomotive, M1 6755, was assigned to Enola at that particular time, along with a number of other ones, and we did the repair work in the machinist craft. We had pipe fitters that did sheet metal work as well as pipe. One or two electricians that handled the lighting for the locomotive. And when they come in, they would be inspected, and there were some things that had to be done on monthly repairs and 6-month repairs and annual inspections. And I won't go into all the details, but a lot of folks don't realize what all is involved in that. And some of the details, when an engine come in the shop, one of the things that in the area of safety, when a locomotive come in the shop, the hostler, when he'd bring it in, there was a bolt that went into this snifting valve, is what they called it, and it had a plate on the outside. And when that went in there, into that bolt was screwed in there and pushed the valve away and allowed the steam to come out. Then, if for some reason someone was in the cab and moved the throttle and the reverse rod, steam would come out there and set it to the cylinders and the main valve, and safety factor to prevent unnecessary move or hazard in one way or another. I guess some of the things that we did was we'd use the bars a lot. We would there's a pair of shoes that runs back and forth in here. It's called the lap and lead lever, and there's a pair of brass shoes in there. And if they were worn real bad, we'd take these nuts off on each side and remove this as well, take the lap and lead lever off, take them in and get them rebabbited, and that would work with a slide of the main valve back and forth on the engine. This is called the lap and lead lever, and it all works together. The radius rod and the eccentric rod back there as well were involved. And when the throttle was open, the steam would come into the main valve and, of course, down to the piston, move the crosshead, and act with your main rods there. The main rod's missing on this little jewel. It sets in here. As the pin goes through, and it goes back, and it would slide on to the main pin. And from there, then you get your timing arrangement set up. This crank arm and eccentric rod and the link, which he would operate the reverse lever, and the cabin would set it up. This is set right now to go forward. When the engine is stopped, it's set up into the middle, so it couldn't go either way. Of course, clear to the top would adjust your valve so that your engine could move backwards. I see they left the parallel rods on that run from number 1, 2, and 3, and 4 off of the main pin. All 4 would, of course, work at the same time while they were running, if necessary, mostly when they starting a train. The sand pipe come down, operated by the engineer, would lay sand on the track. Everybody would hope that there wasn't wet sand up there, because he wouldn't get any on the track and have a lot of trouble with that matter. Also on the crosshead, you can see the groove in there that's worn. They had a material in there much similar to what's used up on that lap and lead lever. And they'd go into the blacksmith shop where we had a man that worked on rebabbiting these crossheads, and those liners up there as well. An inspection would include checking all the nuts and bolts. Be a man that would be working in the same area, and there's a lubricating fitting goes in there. There's one in there, and of course there's 2 up here. It lubricates these there. Anything that moves had to be lubricated, and of course this yoke runs the whole way across the engine. And you see the same arrangement on the other side. Of course, the timing's different because if the engine was be on center with both sides, then you couldn't move your engine. So one set of rods is set in one position, and there's a half a turn difference between the one and the other side. So one of the cylinders is able to make steam and power the engine, get it started. This was called the guide that is bolted on the front and on the yoke here in both places. It's a very important place to keep tight, and they had a tendency to, over a period of time, to work loose, and sometimes the bolts had to be taken out and move the crosshead ahead, move the engine, drop the bolts out, go in the machine shop, and a machinist in the machine shop would come out and measure the opening, and you get a tight fit bolt put back on, and be tightened up once more. On the inside here we have our brake cylinders. It's called a 16-inch brake cylinder. It was 16 inches in diameter, and they controlled the brake cylinder speed and the braking on the locomotive. And let me see. And underneath we have some piping going in there. It goes into the exhaust part of the locomotive, which comes from the air compressor on the other side. 16-inch cylinders in diameter.
Okay.
And they control the braking on the locomotive. There's one on each side. Of course, I mentioned the sand pipe. I think you already have that, don't you? And this is the main reservoir. There are 2. One on this side, one on the other side. The pressure's controlled with proper valves, and they carry 140 pound at that time, 140 pound pressure. And when it dropped so far, the air compressor would cut in and put it back up to bring it back up to whatever the setting was on the governor. This is called a link, and sometimes they had to be removed to probably renew the block in there to tighten it up so there's not a lot of play. If you get a lot of play in this equipment, then your engine is out of time, and it's difficult to do the job it's supposed to do. So all these things have to be inspected on a periodical basis. And when the engineer has the reverse lever up there, if he pulls it back, this rod goes up and it readjusts the main valve, this area here. Inside is the main valve. It's a spool valve, so long, got rings on each end, and they're fit up very neat in that cylinder, so that when the steam comes down out of the steam chest, it's called the steam chest, where it comes down into the valve, and depending on the location of the lapping lead and the valve gear would determine how much steam went into this cylinder. If he wanted to go in reverse position, and of course that valve, that main valve they called it, was moved to a position where this side of the engine would go in reverse. Same thing takes place on the other side, so when we get over there we won't have to look at that too much. This is called a knuckle pin. That nut is screwed off there after that key is taken out, and what they call, there's a furrow in there. It's a bushing, and you have to set them. If you just want to take that pin out, you got to set the engine so you could get it in the right spoke. Most of the time it's set on the bottom, what we call it being set on the bottom. And you move the engine around till the rods came down there, then you can take that nut off, and take that knuckle pin out and make the repairs that need to be done to them. They do have a tendency to wear. On the top's a grease fitting, aluminum fitting that lubricates that inside, and if it isn't getting proper lubrication, you're going to have to take it apart. This is the main pin in here, and I think I mentioned the eccentric rod, and the main rod, of course, goes up to that crosshead, and when that has a pin on the inside as well. And we have to take a main rod off to renew the brass on there is what we called it. It was brass go around the pin and also inside the rod, the main rod, and in this rod. They both have a brass bearing that belongs in there, but it's cut into pieces, like 4 pieces. And there's holes drilled out in it so that when you put aluminite in, that's an aluminite fitting. No, that's a grease fitting. There's the aluminite fitting. You put grease in there, it would come down and went around the brass that's in there. The brass would be drilled. And I can't describe anyway that it's just like a big round piece of brass bored out, and then they would cut it in 4 slices and slide it right in there. It has a lot of holes in it, and when you put the grease gun on there, it squeezes down through the holes in the brass and goes in to lubricate the pin so it don't run hot. You got that. Same way with the marine rod. You put the rod on, put a piece of the brass on the top, slide the rod on, put the rest of it in there, couple it up to the crosshead, and then the crank arm. All this works together. It has to work together, or you're not going to go anywhere. But they wear. See, there's an aluminite fitting there. There's an aluminite fitting here. There's a good shot of the spring rigging on the inside. This part here is called a saddle, and that bolt. See how it's cut off up there? Okay, that sets down on the saddle, and then the spring sits on top of that, and then has its motion back and forth. Sometimes they would wear to the point where your engine would be too low. That's hard to believe, but you get a whole side of them that's worn real bad, and it'll drop your engine down, and it won't pass the ICC inspection. Well, it's not ICC now, but that's what it was then. So we would have to set the engine on the drop table, block it up, and replace those pins. It wasn't called a pin, it's a roller. I forget that name. It's a roller. And let me see. This is the hanger for the brake, part of the brake rigging. Boy, you can't move anything on this animal. Brake shoe. They'd be renewed when they were worn. They used to come in every 30 days for what they called a boiler wash. They would wash the boiler. I'll show you how they did that in a few minutes. There's another sand pipe for this wheel. And when you look at what we just looked at, you got the same thing on the other side, except for the piping. That reservoir comes off the air compressor on the other side, and this pipe goes back and feeds the air brake equipment up in the cab. If you have a problem up there, there's a cutout cock, or you'd cut it out. You see that? Cut that out. That bleeds the air out of this side of the air brake equipment, so you can take it apart and work on it, whatever needs to be done. This is a centrifugal pump. It pulls water off of the hose back here, which is missing. And you have to adjust it there if it needs adjusted. We would put a gauge in here, and from there you could the engineer would up in the cab would open a valve, put steam down here, and run that pump, centrifugal pump. In other words, that can run and still not move water if there's no need for it up there. That was exhausted out here. The steam would come down in this pipe, turn the turbine there. You got it? Okay. It would be exhausted down here. So that would bring water into the water would be sucked into here, drawn in, and go through the mechanism. And let me see where I'm at again. Yeah, the pump would be on this side, and you would pump the water up through here. It's not a pump. I don't know how else to describe it. It's a centrifugal pump, I guess you'd say. And then the water would be pulled up through there, shoved up through there, and then we'd go up to the top. I have to show you up on top again. Now the water would be coming out. This line back here, it's got a check valve in it, a big knob in there, and most people wouldn't have any idea what. And we pump it up into there, and up here's a heater box. Up on top, that pipe would put water up into that heater box on top. Now that had a lot of small valves up there, and the exhaust steam, it was coupled to the exhaust steam coming out of the cylinders, and it would heat that water in that box. It also had a float up there like your box on the back of your commode. When that box would get full, that would shut off. Therefore, that pump back there, that centrifugal pump, could keep on running. Didn't hurt anything, it wouldn't burn up or nothing. As soon as that pump on the other side got enough water out of that box, it went down, the float went down, and this valve opened up and put more water back in the box. Then the pump back there would, of course, have water right against it and shove it through. A very economical way to put water in a steam engine. Take that cap off to get into the throttle. Inside that dome, there's a pipe about 6 inches in diameter, maybe 8 in diameter. And it runs from the throttle clear out, and I can't describe it. Went through a lot of what we call units and headers inside this smoke box, the front end of the locomotive. They called them superheater units. They ran back through the boiler back and forth, and put a greater, heated the steam more than it would be under natural conditions. Then it would come back and come down in pipes from the inside in the smoke box. that section there where you see it says M1B, you see that? Huh?
Yeah.
Okay, that one section there from that water pipe right behind it out to the front is where your smokestack is, all your netting at when you exhaust your coal burning, you know, smoke and all that hit that screen and knock down a lot of the soot and the dirty little things we don't like in our soup. You don't get anything like that, of course, but that took care of section back there, the throttle chamber they called it. Was very large. It was probably that long, probably 4 feet in length, big around. It had a big opening where this dry pipe went into, and then your throttle from your engineer was coupled to a valve on top, right up at the top of the steam dome. That's where your steam's considered the hottest in a boiler of this nature. And when he opened the throttle, or he pulled out the throttle back there, this valve opened up and allowed the steam to go down into that dry pipe. And then it got into the two headers out there and through the units. You're not going to remember a lot of this. Through the units, and they were small, like pieces of pipe. The average man, they run back and forth inside the boiler, and they called it superheated steam. Every railroad had it, I think, with big engines. Then it came into large pipes in this section here and down to the main valve. We talked about this equipment necessary to move the engine. It goes from forward to the reverse course. And this cylinder and its appurtenances there are responsible for that. The engineer would throw a lever back there in the cab. It operates that valve on top of this cylinder. Puts air in there, and when he pulls the lever, it makes it easier because the air will transfer from one side of that cylinder to the other side, back and forth. In other words, if he just went up there and moved the lever back and forth, that's exactly what would happen in there. And that would affect your valve gear and equipment here. This will slide up and down off of that cylinder back there. See where it comes out on this quadrant? That's how you operate your reverse mechanism. The reservoir, this is the reservoir on the back of it. If something would happen that he would lose his air, even on the locomotive, if it became necessary, he could use this. The air in here would give you the opportunity to reverse it maybe once or twice, only an emergency basis. That's all it was there for. And let me see what else we got here. Oh, here's some air brake equipment. This big valve here is called number 8 air brake equipment. This is a volume reservoir that's used with all the valve mechanism inside there. This is a reservoir. No, it's not a reservoir, this is a filter. Every so often you have to take that filter down, and there's a paper filter inside of that. And so before the air goes into the equipment here, it goes through this filter. Trying to see where the pipe is. Oh, it goes off there. And it operates this equipment here. There's several positions on the equipment in the cab that has to be moved. The brake valves, and probably you know the meaning of the word brake valve. There's 2 of them up there. And this valve is what controls where the air goes. on the brake shoes and the cylinders up front. This mechanism here is the trailer. It supports the boiler and the cab of the locomotive. Inside here you can't see it, but this part of the trailer is exactly the same on the other side. And they go in and they meet in here in a big bracket that's bolted to both sides. I can't show you the bolts or nothing. They go in that bracket and that pin drops down through, and that keeps that in place. You can't see in there either, but that's a side bearing. That's where, when you on a drop table and you bring the wheels up, they contact underneath. This frame contacts under there, and as a result, bolsters your firebox and your cab and everything associated with it. It has its own spring arrangement away from that up there, other than it plays a role by lifting on this end. And of course, now that little spring down there, you're not going to remember the word I'm going to give you, but that's called a helical spring. You know how to spell that? H-E-L-I-C-A-L. That's a helical spring. That also plays a part in, along with this leaf spring here over the top, in taking care of the back end so you don't get thrown out of the cab. If you don't hang on, you get thrown out anyhow. And let me see. Okay, there's what they call the ash pans inside there. They run from there to about here, inside. When that fireman up there has to get rid of some of these clinkers and so forth, these levers here, you really can't see unless if you can get in there, all you're going to see in there is, it looks like a box. See that piece of metal in there? That's part of the ash pan, right there. This is the operating mechanism for the ash pans to open and close. You want to open, you either, I don't know which way on this one now, but you have to see that when you close them, that lever, that little gadget comes up, and them levers go on the other side and drop down. That latches them in place. You daresn't have them open out in the main line. You burn up ties. And let me see what else is here. Now you got a brake cylinder underneath there for the trailer wheels, a tank valve. And there's a lever underneath there where you can close the valve. Now, this pipe has a large rubber hose. It goes from a connection under there, which you can see right there, and it runs back and to a connection back here on the tender. You see that opening there on that piece of pipe? Can you see that in the dark?
A little.
All right, your tank hose hooks onto that and comes over here and that's where it gets into the engine. If you, for some reason, a tank hose bursts between them, they would close that valve down there. And of course, that's electrical equipment there. I don't think it'd be a cab signal, I mean, I don't know. A drop coupler. Pull that bar out of there, and it goes down. It swings on a pin that goes in across there, both sides. Anyway, that's why you have this type of opening mechanism, operating mechanism. Anyway, if he has to have help and another engine to hook on, you just pull the lever over there and it comes open and he backs in. But if you're, for some reason or other, you're a guy coming back in against you, and there's nobody here, and this knuckle's closed, and he hits that, you're going to bend that bar back underneath there, or that, it's a bar about that big, about that long. He hits this when it's up, and when he hits it, if he hits it when it's down, it's worse yet. Oh, then you can't operate this. It's just bent. It can't be. And so we get in there with a torch and burn the pieces off and pull it out and burn another piece off and put a jack underneath this mechanism. There's a big draft gear back underneath there. It's coupled to that. Anyway, let's go. That door up there, you see them hinges? Mm-hmm. Okay, you knock them bolts loose all around that, and then you go in there, and the first thing you do is you get totally dirty. You wouldn't recognize any man in there. There's a big set of a netting screen that goes across in there. And when your exhaust comes out, that screen and netting breaks up the particles of dust, burnt coal, you understand? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. The big netting goes across there. And I can't tell you much about that in there because it just wouldn't make sense. Here's this is the lubricator. This one's pretty well beat up, but that's what it looks like. If it's necessary, you had a crank on here and you could crank, but this copper tubing went to, well, here's one right here. That supplied lube oil to this crosshead, back and forth, back and forth. There was a connection hooked onto this valve stem in here, as far as I can remember. Maybe it was hooked on here. Oh, here's where it was, yes. See this? There was an arm come down. And that part of the mechanism in there operated on a ratchet system. You know, you turn it so far and it would relatch and turn it so more. You know what I'm talking about? Huh? You got that? Okay. And that would, the way it was designed, would put lube oil into this copper tubing, and it would come down here and supply lube oil there. And I can't remember where the one stem went to. Well, I think one of them went out to the main valve. This was the main valve, and this is the main cylinder and piston. That's a 22-inch diameter there, 26-inch across there, the cylinder. And of course, this lubricator supplied, I think this is it here going in. The lubricating oil for the cylinder. And the one coming here lubricated. These are all lubricated with grease fittings or alamite. Okay. Let me see. Oh, I want to say something to you about this water pump. All right, the pipe came down that side, and I can't remember. There's a connection went in to the boiler right there where you see it's missing. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And that pipe brought the water down into this box. It was heated from up the steam up above, and it went in here, came down and went in here. And I never saw one of them torn down. We didn't have much trouble with them. But there's a piston in there, and this is where it's located. And that piston was like the centrifugal pump. It kept running. And that pipe up there come down and fed this with that hot water off the top, the heater box. And then this pump would go back and forth and shove it into that tube, that pipe up there. That's a piece of copper. It shoved it into that pipe. And there was a connection up there. And we used to take that off every boil wash and take it in the machine shop. And they'd tear it apart and renew anything that was worn or cracked and put it back together. Then we would put it in up there, and they had a valve on the top inside the boiler. And when that pressure was applied from this cylinder here into that pipe, it went up against that valve and shoved it up, opened that valve, and this hot water would spray around in there. Very economical way to heat water for one of these behemoths. That was a good system. This section was the valve portion that operated that piston in there. It had to get steam to operate, you know what I'm saying? Everything on this steam locomotive almost operates with steam. Not all, not all. All right. Here you got to 8.5 cross compound compressors. This is the exhaust coming off of the steam side. And this is the exhaust coming off of, this is a high pressure end of air. It goes out there and goes around to that reservoir out front. Okay. We would take these valves out under here every so often, check them, clean them, replace them if they were needed replaced. And that's, I think I mentioned, that's called a cross compound compressor. You got your steam coming in this side and operates, this is called the low side of the air compressor. It gets its sucks in air from these two filters, both pumps. See, that one's got a manifold on there. Don't scare me like that. And that's got the same thing there. So when that pump's working, that's sucking outside air. When the pump's working, that's sucking that outside air into this large volume. Both sections are steam up there. These are air. When that piston comes down, there's valves in here and puts that air over on this side. That's called the high pressure side. You can't see it because of this lubricator. Now when that piston comes down, it shoves the air that's come over from the low side, and it's compressed. It's a smaller piston and a cylinder, and it's compresses the air. It goes out that pipe and goes up into the reservoir. Both of them do the same thing. This here one, that one there connects on right here. This is a mechanical lubricator, much like similar to that one out there, but it just lubricates the air compressor. Remember I told you about the brass in around the main pin up there for the main rod? Well, you're looking at it. Now I don't think, I can't be sure which. See, there's two sets. One set goes in a parallel rod up there. This is, you know what I mean by the parallel rod? Mm-hmm. This rod, it runs the whole length. Well, you see that's hanging down up there, so they took the bushings out of that. This might be the ones for in there. I wouldn't doubt that a bit. But they put, before you put them on the pin, you put hard grease in there, manually, you know. And they're heavy. I'm an old man, but they didn't seem that heavy. This is one of the, can't remember the name, the Boilermakers, and the boiler wash team that washes the boilers. They take that nut off, turn that gizmo, and that's a brackets type of thing. Turn that around, and that piece there, they can take them out It's amazing, isn't it? And they get up in there. They'll run a hose in here if they look through there and can see through the other side. And it looks like there's a lot of mud and stuff in there, what they get. Maybe they get a fish once in a while, but I'm not sure. And they'll run a hose in there and blow all that, force all that dirt and debris, mostly mud and some scale and stuff, out the other side. And they'll do it likewise on the other side. They got those, I think there's about 4 of them upstairs, up in the cab that they take off, and we'll go up there and take a look at it. Here's the old Sellers. I think that's a Sellers. SR. Sellers. Injector. This is in front of the fireman, this rod, and he'll pull up on that. And we'll get my locations here. I gotta find some steam. That went out, that went out. That's exhaust. Oh, they got that pipe off of there. Pipe on here. It must have went up. I don't think it went up through there. There had to be a steam pipe come down and go in here. It's missing. This is a steam valve. This is a water valve. This water's coming up from the tank back there where I showed you that, where that hose ought to have been. Okay. He pulls up on this slightly, a little bit. He pulls up enough to get the water running, and it'll run out the exhaust. Then he goes a little further to get this this portion is operated by steam. There's a nozzle in there and a valve that sits on top of that nozzle. When he pulls that up, that valve comes up off of that nozzle and puts steam down there. And they call it a combining tube. It's about that long. And it's designed that you can combine steam and water and force both of them up here. That goes on up there into a check valve up on the boiler head, on the head of the boiler. I'll show you that in a few minutes. They work very good if they're, when they're working. They take repairs sometimes too. But that water pump that I showed you out there and that centrifugal pump on the other side, I think they've been the most efficient. And let me see. Okay, here's your valve for your stoker. That's your stoker engine. It's run by steam. And this is its valve. That's this exhaust pipe going out there. There it is. There's a pipe that comes up and feeds the steam into the main valves there. You see that coming across? This must go out the other side, the exhaust. Well, this valve controls that. That's enough to say about that, I guess. And we had men that used to work with the tank gang. Every 3 months we would separate the engine from the tank, and then pins in there would have to be examined to see if they had too much wear on them or not. It kept them together. No way I can show them to you. One under there and one under there. And the tank man worked on that with them, and they also handled the stokers. Well, I don't think all of them. The tank men didn't, but the other machinists would. We used to take these off once in a while, or move them out of the way, or renew some parts in there. And you put the oil in there. When you check them, you put the oil. That's an engine much like, did you ever see a steamboat running on the river?
Yeah.
Well, I noticed when I was, before I graduated from high school, there was 3 companies running steamboats on the river pumping coal into Bethlehem Steel and Harrisburg Steel. And a buddy of mine, 2 of them, their grandfather started one of them businesses on the river. And we worked there on weekends during the war, pumping coal. We'd stand on the end of an old flat out there, and they had a big screen and was pumping the coal up into, and dirt and everything else up in. And that screen would separate the coal from the sand and pebbles and so forth. You had to stand there with a hoe and rake it off. And some of them had them flats that they used had a steam engine much like this. Well, they varied in size, I guess. I just remembered that when I went to work on the railroad. Anyway, bring it out. Can you see that knuckle in there? It's called a knuckle.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that couples up to this engine, this little steam engine here, and that turns that. There's a shaft on the back side there. It goes back into the tender. And there's a big screw back there. And that forces coal up through that big tube over there on the other side of this. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
That's where your coal came out and went up in there. It was part of your stoker operation. You know that little steam engine I showed you down there? Mm-hmm. All right, there's a screw. They got it covered. This plate covers that screw. And the screw goes clear to the back. And that fireman operates a valve there for that engine, that little steam engine, and that screw turns. Brings that coal up, brings it up, brings it up, brings it right up in that pot in there. You see that pot? Mm-hmm. All right, now this next animal there, the back part right there, it's got pipes going into it. And pipes come down under there and come over here. And there was a bracket hung on those. They got them bolts covered now. The bracket hung on there. And then pipes went into that. And then there was a valve for each pipe. And in there, there would be one steam would go out that way, steam out this way. They were designed to spray push the coal around. And he would adjust them valves. What we don't know is, you might think this is the stoker valves, the main valve, and then the one, after they got moving pretty good, you know, he could close this one down and then just operate off of this one, which is, I don't know why, other than that it's just easier to operate. But then when he would have to set his valves, because if he left too much steam go in there and blowed all that coal up front, up on the throat, what they call the throat, where the firebox stops, and there's a well, I didn't show that to you out there. If you bank that up with coal, you're going to run out of steam because it shuts down the opportunity for it to burn clean, you know. So you had to be careful when you adjusted your blower valves there. But that little jewel blowed that coal around in there, and he adjusted how much. In other words, the ones on the side blowing coal that way, they would be closed much closer than what the ones on it had to blow it straight ahead. Anyway, that took care of that little thing. The pedal here, see that pedal? That operated that fire door with the cylinder here. And when they cleaned the fire, these were your, shaking grate. This is where you would shake the grates. They called it a shaking grate lever. It was that they set down on those pieces of metal there, and then they would shake that back and forth, and that would turn your boy, you got me. The grates would turn, and he would, and they would have you see this? See this? You see that other bracket up there and back there? Mm-hmm. Well, they had tools on there that they used in the firebox. One was about that wide, and it was like a hoe, sort of. Then they had a big long one, was probably that long, and they would get in there and poke around with the clinkers. They would get clinkers if they weren't careful because of the way they fired. Some guys were good and some weren't too good. But that's where that equipment was kept. And once in a while, when these doors was open, and he had pulled all them slides out of the way, and he didn't know it, that one of them bars would drop down into that screw, and he hand fired that engine the rest of the way to the lick, because that would stall it. Anyway, most everything is missing. This is a check valve. It operates with that injector down below there. They come in for boil washing. It'd be reported anything that was leaking. We'd take the cap off, and then we'd get in there with a tool, and we'd grind the seats of that valve and get rid of that, because in the wintertime, if that valve was leaking steam or hot water, and that fireman was sitting there, and that leaked out the exhaust down there for the discharge for the injector, it would blow up, come right up in his face. They complained about that a lot. So we tried to avoid that. You know what this is?
Yes, that makes it go.
That makes it go.
That's good.
That makes it go. By God, can you imagine that? Needs oil.
I'm not surprised.
Will you take care of that?
We will eventually.
Are you serious?
Eventually.
You mean you got this scheduled?
Well, first one we have on the list is the E6.
The what?
The
E6?
E6.
You
Small
gonna-
passenger.
Are you going to get that running?
Not running, but cleaned up
Yeah.
considerably and stabilized. And eventually we'll get to all of these.
What's the color of the paint we used on the old PRR?
Tuscan red.
Tuscan red. I believe that you got one. That one you have here is Tuscan red on it.
Mm-hmm.
The reversing lever.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't see any marks on that now, but many of the engineers would have, when he got on an engine and start working it out on the road after he's out of the yard, he would put marks on there where he did the best with the engine. He could get the best. When he would start out, he would have the lever clear down in the corner. That's what they called that, Cleveland. And that gave you all them cylinders and valves could handle out there. That was getting everything. But after you got going real good, then they would be, if you left it that way, you'd like running second gear. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So he would gradually ease this lever back and put a mark on it. It all depends how many stops he was going to make along the way. We had a one board called Even East, Odd West. We had a board that went from Enola to Altoona, and it was marked up as M9. M9 was west, Even East, Odd West, yeah. And it would be M10 coming back to Enola. And them crews would have to make stops along. That was one train that made stops along different places of industry. Maybe some at Lewistown, maybe some at Thompsontown, whatever. And of course, when he would have to stop at them places, and he could, once he got going, he would pull that reversing lever back and adjust these valves so he didn't burn up all the coal and water. This is number 8 brake valve. This one operates the brakes on the train. This one operates the brakes on the locomotive. You're going to have to get that repaired. It won't move. This was number 8 equipment. Before that was a number 6. Nothing to do with this. Then they went to number 8. Then they went to number 24. You see them 3 valves up there?
Mm-hmm.
There's no rod. All right, they had rods on the bracket, and they were over here. And there's one place you can't, see that piece of pipe with a valve on it there? That was probably the steam gauge.
Right.
And these three valves, they had pipes that come down here, and then there was a bracket with a. Let me show you. Look at me. Pipes on them would come down into a V-shaped sort of funnel that was attached here, and with those, they would get a pretty good picture of what the water level was in their boiler. I think they called them mountain gauge cocks at the time, because when an engine was going up a steep grade, the water was coming back here, you know, and sometimes the engine was leaning this way, and your water bottles were. They even got that going. There was a water bottle set on here. There was one over there for the firemen, and you'd have a full bottle of water leaning with it. Naturally, if the engine's leaning this way, it's all going to be back here, and you're going to have a full bottle of water. But when you get up at the top, if you weren't watching closely and knew what you're doing, you might just have a little bit in the bottom of the bottle, because there's no other way. And they were pretty fussy about that. This here bracket here with a little nick in it, that had something to do with locating the water bottles on an engine. There's one over there too. Don't ask me what it is. I was never involved in that. That was before my time too, and I'm old. I retired. I was the federal inspector at Enola on daylight, and one of them Tuscan Reds was. They had a business train with a bunch of business cars, you know. And the last one was a car that had a lot of seats in it that you could, almost in a living room, but it wasn't, of course. That they would take people on a business trip, and they could see what's going on around the countryside, wherever they've been or whatever they live. They took some. I know they took some trips just to examine the track, see how much rock motion you get, how well the track was being maintained. They did some of that work.
We hope to have Don talk on a future program about his life experiences on the railroad. Thank you for watching Rails Around York. Call 843-7722 with your comments.
Good night.